I'm Kathleen Dollard, and welcome to this week's webcast on upcoming changes to C#, Visual Basic, and Visual Studio. This series is brought to you by Wintellect Now. You can find great courses in the catalog at www.wintellectnow.com. This week I'll talk about changes to Visual Studio itself. I'm running CTP4, which I've installed on a touch-enabled laptop. Remember, this is a CTP, which means there's no guarantee it's stable. So don't install this on a machine you need for other purposes. But if you have a test machine, it should run side by side with Visual Studio 2013. To check out new features without altering your machine or creating a local VM, build an Azure VM with Visual Studio 14 CTP4 installed. I showed how to do that in last week's webcast. Last week I also showed the Breakpoint Peak dialog, which I think is the coolest new feature in Visual Studio. You might notice the return to proper case menus. This is also available as an option in recent Visual Studio 2013 updates. Starting with CTP3 and CTP4, if you have a high-resolution monitor, you should see better icons. The reason I'm working locally is that I want to show the new touch capabilities. Here, I'll swipe to scroll, pinch to zoom, tap and hold for the context menu. I can also double tap to highlight a word, or tap in the margin to highlight a line. I haven't used a mouse for any of these actions. Other things like selecting from menus require a more exact touch, but a little patience and a good set of keyboard shortcuts, and you can experiment being mouse-free. The editor was largely rewritten using Roslyn to evaluate source code, rather than the earlier redundant parsing. This has many advantages, including extensibility of the analyze and fix refactoring that shows up as the light bulb. You'll fix things with Control-, just like in previous versions. Here, I'll correct the system name for character to the alias. I used the mouse, but I could also have done that with Control-. You can also use alternate period to get very rapid refactoring. After highlighting some code, I'll hit alternate period and then enter, type in a name, and I'm done with an extract method refactoring. It's just over a second when I'm in the zone. The distinction between alternate and Control-, can be a bit fuzzy. You use Control- for using refactorings and renaming variables. There's two new refactorings available through alternate period. One supports the creation of a new variable to represent part of a complex expression. And inlining temporary variables does the reverse, to make a more complex expression and avoid the use of a variable. Another great thing about Visual Studio 14 is you can access the peak definition window in XAML. Alternate F12 opens a code peak, here for the code of the button click method. Just like in other code, you can make changes in the peak window. While it was missing from some earlier CTPs, shared projects are now available. The other important feature I want to show from the current CTP is perf tips. I'll show this by creating records with my silly debugging class from last week. It would often be nice to keep an eye on performance without requiring a full analysis. I'll set a breakpoint before I create records, and then step to the next line of code. 3 milliseconds elapsed. That's the elapsed time, similar to starting a stopwatch before and stopping it after the call. What about 150? There's no difference. 3 milliseconds is just really, really fast. Let me try 1500 just to make sure it's working. Well, there's a change, with 11 milliseconds. What about 150,000? And if I want to check the elapsed time for several lines of code, I can just use a different mechanism for my next break, this time a second breakpoint instead of stepping. 182 milliseconds for 150,000 records. Clearly, I do not have a performance problem here. Perf tips are most helpful in finding places that have adequate performance, excluding portions of your app so you can narrow down the portion of your app that is slowing it down. If you find that you have a problem, you'll want to use other Visual Studio profiling tools to explore further. Profiling during debugging just isn't the best approach for a real analysis. You can find several courses on profiling in the course library at Wintellect Now. Come back next week when I give an update to Visual Basic 14. After that, I'll take a look at the CLR in .NET 4.5.3 and more features on C#.